let's talk about the frontline situation, because the frontline situation right now is not good. Okay, let me be honest with you guys. The frontline situation in Ukraine right now is not good. The frontline is collapsing. We're still talking about like 0.01% of the country falling this month, 0.02% of the country falling that month. We're not talking about major cities being captured, as in like city 500,000 people, but we're talking about a deterioration of the situation amongst multiple points in the front line, making it so that Ukrainian resources need to be spread out where they respond. So let's just talk about the different places that the Ukrainians are facing difficulty right now. Let's start with the situation that's bad, but of course it's not the worst situation right now, in Kursk. If you look in the Kursk area, you can see that the Russians, through time, have taken more and more through counteroffensives. The counteroffensives probably started more than a month ago, and they fought to take back Sakhnost and all these other places around here in the western side of the Ukrainian incursion into Kursk. And since then, they've been able to push the Ukrainians back from the border with Kornevo. Back from there, they've been able to take Snagnost, and they've been able to keep pushing. Now, this has been at big casualties, as you can see the different notifications here for casualties that the Russians have taken. But you can see, just in the last month, the Russians have been able to make headway into the Ukrainian incursion into Kursk. And they are pushing along these highways, these roads, and you can see videos coming out online of these vehicles being destroyed. This is a Russian MTLB being destroyed. There's Russian tanks getting destroyed, of Ukrainian shelling decimating the Russian forces, and they've taken losses here, but the Russians have made gains. They've pushed the Ukrainians back solidly for Kornevo, which was a location that the Ukrainians were dreaming about taking earlier during the ending of the peak of the Ukrainian crossing into Kursk. And we're seeing the Ukrainian incursion going from 1,000 square kilometers of territory controlled to 750 square kilometers of territory being controlled. So a sizable shift in control of territory in Kursk. Does this come at high casualties? Yes. Does this mean that these are Russian soldiers that could be pushing in Pokrovsk, that could be pushing in Volchansk, could have helped them hold the aggregate plant or otherwise? Yes. But another side to put here, and here's the more positive side, is the Russians said that they plan to push the Ukrainians out of Kursk by mid-October. It is now going into late October. So the Russians did not meet their deadline. They failed at meeting their deadline, but now they've simply pushed that deadline over into February of 2025, giving them another 3, 4 to 5 months to try to push the Ukrainians out of Sudza and otherwise. Oh, I can also tell you, all of this fighting, the situation becoming more difficult, quote unquote, to use the term that I kept hearing when I was in Sumy trying to get into Kursk, it has made it much more difficult for journalists to do reporting in Kursk. But who knows, that might change. That might change with time. The Ukrainians do have some small incursions over the border here, but they have not been able to push it past this to Glushkovo, especially since the Russians have been able to reconnect Glushkovo to the land here and not just have the bridges that were bridging them past this river that was dividing them and straining their logistics. It has just made the Russian control of Glushkovo only that much more stable. So while the Ukrainians still hold a lot of territory over here, and the Ukrainians have redeployed the 47th over here, which means Abrams and Bradleys doing heavy fighting over in this area, which might help them stabilize the situation, the Ukrainians are not massively expanding their holdings over here at the moment. And they are on, at least when it comes to the west side of this, on the back foot. Okay, so that's the first situation that's developing. The second situation, now there is some positive news on this front about some territory being retaken, but it's all very minor. The aggregate plant being retaken is kind of old news, but the Russians have not been able to push the Volchansk front much, if at all. Another area where the situation is just absolutely terrible is right here, or up here. And if you see right here, according to this, the Russians could have just already cut off Kupiansk from the territory to the south. So what people have been scared of when it comes to the Kupiansk front, this is territory that was recaptured by the Ukrainians during the Kharkiv counteroffensive, and they were able to retake Kupiansk. But what the Russians have been trying to do is push to cut off Kupiansk from this land border, to strain it logistically so the Ukrainians cannot transport supplies and troops using this road upwards, and instead will have to supply it over the river, which the Russians could then target the bridges and, you know, other stuff to that, you know, bridges and pontoon boats that the Ukrainians could use to supply this side of Kupiansk, which is divided by the river. But now with what looks like the Russian capturing of this area, of this Kupiansk land border, trail, this, you know, this access to the south, almost certainly cut off. I actually had not seen that it had been completely cut off before this stream. I still thought there was 2 kilometers, but this would indicate that since last time we were talking about the Russians moving up along this tree line, that they've jumped off this tree line to capture all of this territory. Now, whether they hold this down here and have completely cut it off is still up into question. It's still being fought over pretty viciously right now. But in the long term trends seem to indicate that this land bridge is going to be cut off. And this is not only bad for the continued holding of Kupiansk and the continued defense of all of this across the river in the Kharkiv region, and could lead to the losses of a decent chunk of territory. But the other thing that is scary for Ukrainian forces is the pressure this could lead down south. If you go from down south, from where this has been cut off, it's now much easier for the Russians to move down south this way and start adding more pressure to other locations where the Russians are pushing. For example, if you go down here, you can find locations like Donetsk. You can find other locations to the north of Donetsk that the Russians are fighting over very, very viciously right now. And the more that the Russians push down south, the more pressure is added to Donetsk in locations like Limon. And the more pressure that it's under from the north, it adds to the pressure that it's getting from the east. It makes it harder and harder and harder and harder and harder and harder for the Ukrainians to defend these last locations in the Donetsk region. And the places that it's probably scariest for in the long term is places like Sloviansk and Kramatorsk. Because if they're getting pushed from the east and the Russians are pushing from this direction down south towards Pokrovsk, and then the Russians are pushing from up north from the direction of Kupiansk, then you have the 2 largest last bastions of resistance in Donetsk, which were retaken by the Ukrainians back in 2014, Sloviansk and Kramatorsk, cities of hundreds of thousands of people being attacked from 3 sides, under pressure from 3 sides. And even though it's a much bigger city than, say, Bakhmut, it's a much bigger city than, say, Pokrovsk, this city, under immense pressure and artillery fire and MLRS fire and missile fire from 3 sides, reinforced with glide bombs, and a disregard for the lives of the infantry charging these cities, that could put them under immense pressure. The Russians are, let me put it this way, if you think that the Russians are aiming towards just a negotiated settlement that would allow it just to freeze what they have here, one big skepticism I want to throw to that is that they seem to be continuing operations that shape further offensives. Taking this is only useful to shape offensives to take Kupiansk and to shape offensives to go down south. Taking Pokrovsk is only as useful, and this is the other front that you need to keep a heavy look at, a heavy eye on, is only useful for following up and taking up more territory in like Kramatorsk, Sloviansk, and straining the logistics of cities like Chasiv Yar, which is under immense pressure right now. And speaking of these 2 locations, first, if you talk about Chasiv Yar, where is Chasiv Yar? Here it is. The Russians are making progress to the south of it. There's been some reports of them crossing over the reservoir here into the city itself, but it's still being fought over. How much progress that is being made there is still a question mark, but it is very nerve-wracking. And to the south, the Russians are making more progress on the flank of Chasiv Yar to the south, which is going to put more pressure on its logistics. It's going to mean more artillery fire from the south if they can stabilize the situation, meaning pressure on the city of Chasiv Yar, not just from the east across the reservoir, but also from the south put it under more pressure when Ukrainian lines are also already overstretched when it comes to manpower, and more recruits will not be coming probably for another month or two as we wait for the recent mobilization wave to finally take its effect. And even then, there'll still be manpower problems and logistical problems, with even the most bold predictions from the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense and Syrskyi saying that there is a artillery disadvantage of 2-to-1 in the best estimates, meaning best case scenario across the front line, the Russians fire 2 shells for every 1 shell the Ukrainian fires. But let me tell you, in a lot of hot spots, like for example Kursk, when I was there, the local soldiers report a much bigger disparity. It depends on the locality. It depends on the locality that you're located in. But Chasiv Yar is now under immense influence, immense pressure from the south. And this isn't the only city. And once they cross Chasiv Yar, I mean, then that leads them to getting closer and closer to Konstantinivka, which there's a lot of good people I know in Konstantinivka. I know their gas station, their Oko over there is quite famous for visits from Zelensky. And, you know, I went there actually. The patch on one of my body armor sets has an Oko patch from the Konstantinivka Oko. That's going to be wide open for attack. And you can even see the pathway. I mean, like once they flank Chasiv Yar, they go from Chasiv Yar to Konstantinivka. It's going to be under much more artillery pressure. It's going to be under much more pressure from advancing forces. And from there, you, again, hop, skip, and a jump to Kramatorsk and Slovansk. From the Russians completing their conquering of the Donetsk region and the displacement of hundreds of thousands of more people. But Chasiv Yar is not the only place in the Donetsk region where the Ukrainians are under immense pressure. Another location where the Ukrainians are under immense pressure is Selydove. Now, this is to the south of Pokrovsk and is vital for Pokrovsk's defense, because if Selydove falls, it'll be much easier for the Russians to swing around here and then not only be attacking Pokrovsk from this direction, but also be attacking Pokrovsk from the south, be attacking Pokrovsk from multiple directions, starting to flank Pokrovsk, starting to strain the supply lines and the roads that are going into Pokrovsk, not just with longer range missiles and longer range UAVs, but also artillery fire. Once stuff gets within the range, supply lines and cities gets within the range of artillery fire, that's when all hell really starts to break loose. And if Selydove falls, it'll be much easier for them to swing around and bring more pressure upon Pokrovsk and its twin city of Mirorod. Now, if you look at the defense of Selydove, the Russians have already entered the city. They've entered the city from the east, and you can see it from Ukrainian videos. This is a video showing Ukrainian drone attack on advancing Russian forces. This is video showing Ukrainian airstrikes, and the Ukrainians don't have a ton of glide bombs, and they don't have a lot of aircraft to use. You can see that the Ukrainians prioritize this because they're throwing their airstrikes in this way. They're risking the safety of their pilots and their aircraft to try to slow down the Russian advance into Selydove. But they keep advancing. Here you can see Ukrainian drone attacks, which seem to mark where roughly in these little, village homes on the outskirts, getting bombed by Ukrainian drones, roughly marking the front line. So the Russians have taken about 20% of Selydove, if you look around here. 20%, but slowly expanding to 25 to 30%. And I honestly expect them to keep crawling forward. And I expect that process to pick up probably very rapidly. While the Ukrainians are responding to try to slow down the process, try to stop that process, you can see the Russians are advancing to the north, and they already control these villages to the north and are advancing in this direction too. And the more that villages like this fall, or villages like this fall, or the more progress they make up here to get closer to Pokrovsk, if these two villages fall, Seldove's defense is even more compromised. If they can get around here to these roads or these intersections, even though there's a lot of wide open fields here, so it's going to take casualties. It's going to take a big mechanized assaults, a lot of infantry on motorcycles, and it's going to come with drones and artillery and everything Ukrainians can throw at them to try to get across these fields, because you can see the environment here. This is not a bunch of tree lines. It's going to take their cars getting on this road and driving, and the Ukrainians know that they're going to come that way. Their artillery is already pre-calculated to come that way, but the Russians will come that way nonetheless. And if they're flanking them from both sides, it's not even a question of, oh, we knew they were coming, what was the problem? If you don't have enough ammunition, you don't have enough ammunition. You don't have enough troops in a trench to hold that position. You don't have enough troops in a trench to hold that position. And at a certain point, it becomes pointless. It even becomes self-destructive to have your soldiers hold a position that is impossible to hold, especially if you're going to need those troops to hold the positions behind that trench once that trench falls. And so with Selydove being surrounded on both sides, there is a calculus that needs to be made. You want the Russians to pay for every inch taken. If the Ukrainians are to win or to get a negotiated settlement that's on their interests and, that they can say, we did the best we could, they're going to have to make the Russians pay for every little inch. But the longer they hold on to Selydove while it's getting flanked, the worse the situation will become for the troops that need to retreat out of Selydove once it becomes no longer tenable to hold. Because if they wait another month or two, and then Russian advances around Selydove get to that intersection, and then they start crossing over to these villages, and into the south, they come down, they take this village, and then they come down to take that village, and then the escape route is just through these villages. They got to run down these roads. When that order to evacuate is given, if the Russian artillery is in position and pre-calculated on the expected escape routes, if they have the intelligence from inside the Ukrainian armed forces, and I hope it isn't as bad as it used to be, but during 2015, it was a major problem with Russian soldiers in Ukrainian units giving their locations to the Russians. If they have that information or can make a good guesstimate of where they're going to evacuate and they got the guns in place, then they could massacre the retreating troops, and the process by which the Ukrainians are supposed to drain the Russians could end up draining the Ukrainians. And so at a certain point, once the position is too encircled, and this doesn't just apply to Selydove, this also applies to Chasiv Yar. This applies to every location on the front that's dealing with this. If you go down a little south of Chasiv Yar, it applies to these locations here. You can see the same process happening here. They're gonna have to pull out, and then the Russians will flood into the salient, capturing these villages, capturing these small cities, but the Ukrainians will still have more men. More men that were willing to stay in their trench and fight and hold off the Russians, when other soldiers that might later be told to retake their position if these guys die in Selydove might be not as willing, might not be as eager, might not be volunteers or even reluctant soldiers, but people who would much rather be home and got caught going to a party at late night, and that's the only reason they're in a trench, is because they couldn't duck the conscription officer when he came a-knocking. Point is, the Ukrainians are under pressure from getting flanked on both sides of Selydove. To the south, they're facing a somewhat similar problem there. They're facing problems in Chasiv Yar getting flanked to the south. Donetsk is facing brutal street fighting, and so is New York, as you can see here, which I'm surprised New York hasn't fallen. Honestly, one of the biggest pieces of credit I got to give is to the troops defending the northern part of New York that has made a battle that I thought was going to be over a month or a month and a half, maybe even 2 months ago, has stretched it out for months, making them bleed for every inch of it. But the Ukrainians are under immense pressure just about everywhere. Now, there is like some shining lights to this. There is some shining perspectives. For one, if you read Russian military telegrams and not just Russian state media, you'll hear from them that the situation on the front line is bleak for their army. They're overstretched. They have low manpower. Some reports are saying half of the artillery shells that Russia is firing is North Korean, so they have an ammunition crisis that is being propped up by, I don't know what to call the North Korean economy, but by the Hermit Kingdom's economy, by the North Korean war economy. They have a massive problem when it comes to their long-term sustainability of the amount of armor that they're losing in these assaults. The type of assaults that, as much as they are relying now more on mass infantry assaults, they're relying on these motorcycles and new tactics, you still need armored vehicles to take well-entrenched positions. You still need armored vehicles to do a lot of these assaults. Troops will still feel safer in armored vehicles, and you do not want to put every single one of your elite soldiers on a motorcycle and just hope the Ukrainians don't have some, cluster bombs available in an M777 howitzer, or, 5 or 15 or 20 FPV drones on standby with some incendiary bombs ready to roast the Russians. They're going to need those armored vehicles. And so the Russians continue these operations, continue the pressure, continue to try to develop new breakthroughs, even if they're micro breakthroughs that are then expanded and then they make cauldrons. They do that at extreme cost. And the reason we're hearing about North Korean soldiers serving in the Russian army is because their losses are so tremendously high to such an extent that could never be accepted by its Western counterparts domestically. It could not. And if the media in Russia was unrestrained, the amount of human sacrifice that is being made, which I don't know how you can call it anything other than that, when you see how some of these assaults are conducted, is so horrific that in an uncontrolled media environment, you would have to expect that the Russian public would react differently. But we don't live in that world. We live in the world where the Russian public has a controlled media space, We live in a world where the Russian mill bloggers even get cracked down upon if they get a little too critical of grandpa. So even if it's under immense costs, the Russians, for the time being, can continue to sustain offensive operations. And if it is true that North Korea is sending thousands of soldiers to help Putin, which the British, the South Koreans, the Ukrainians, and now even the American government seem to all indicate that that's the pathway that this is going, whether we're going to see these soldiers on the front line or not has yet to be seen, but that's what the Ukrainians fear. That means more manpower and more pressure. And something that's interesting about this Economist article, and why I'm bringing up this specific Economist article, is because how they talk about Ukraine's victory plan in this article. Let me read you about this, because they're talking about many of the same frontline situations that I am. Ukraine's worries go far beyond the shaky front lines. Western support, already stretched thin, is looking more precarious than before. This week, the G7 further fleshed out the details of a loan of $50 billion to be paid for by interest on seized Russian assets. Final agreement should be reached in the next few days. But if Donald Trump wins America's elections, now 2 weeks away, much of its direct military assistance could be choked off. A victory by Harris offers no promises either. Germany, Ukraine's second biggest backer, has already signaled that aid will fall. France has done likewise. So Germany has indicated that because of deficiencies in the Bundeswehr, which is the German armed forces, they are going to be allocating a lot of their new productive material to replenishing its own armed forces, and that future aid commitments to Ukraine they have to find a budget for it. For example, through seized Russian assets, etc. This was a big ask by one of the members of the Green Light, the Traffic Light Coalition, which is made up of Olaf Scholz's Social Democrats, the Green Party, and the FDP, which are like these kind of like market-loving liberals. The market-loving liberals, the FDP, said that any future aid to Ukraine has to be justified with other parts of the budget. Basically, we need to find new ways to access it. Now, is that a deep prioritization of Ukraine's defense as a European security priority? Yes, because you're saying that it's too expensive to defend the gates of Europe in that way. But it does not necessarily mean that there's going to be no aid from Germany, just that it's going to be much harder to work out a financing of that aid if the Traffic Light Coalition, stays in power in Germany in about a year when elections are said to come around. Meanwhile, Russia is busy internationalizing its war. Last week, Andrei Belousov and Russia's defense minister met officials in China for talks on strengthening military cooperation. Iran continues to supply Russia with drones, though its long-promised ballistic missiles have not appeared so far. The North Korean relationship is growing with strength. We have partners, they have allies, grumbles Mr. Budyov. That's Ukraine's head intelligence guy. Ukraine is already neck deep in a world war, he warns. Just like the early days of the Second World War, not everyone sees it yet. Ukraine is keen to use North Korean involvement to boost its own diplomatic efforts. In such circumstances, our relations with partners need further development, Mr. Zelensky said on October 13th. 3 days later, the Ukrainian president published his 5-point victory plan, previously presented in private to American officials. The key points are proposals that Ukraine should receive an invitation to NATO, a bigger arsenal of weapons, and something described as non-nuclear deterrence, essentially a large number of long-range missiles that could take out key logistical and military targets in Russia. A senior Ukrainian official, who asked to remain anonymous, says the package should be interpreted as coercive diplomacy, or a way to get Russia to negotiate peace on more favorable terms. But the same official was also frank. This escalatory potential had not been well received in Washington. They say it's a non-starter, though part of the problem is they don't tell the Ukrainian president that to his face. This is the thing that's interesting to me about this Economist article. It's the only real reason we're reading it, is this paragraph right here. The same official was frank. Its escalatory potential has not been received well in Washington. They say it's a non-starter, though part of the problem is they don't tell the Ukrainian president that to its face. Number one, this is one official that's being quoted. So taking this as gospel, when it's one official, and that could come with all of the biases and personal self-interest and purposeful media manipulation that can come with that. It's one person. But I want to throw this out there. The Russians right now are recruiting the North Korean military production into the war. They are recruiting North Korean missiles, North Korean engineers, and now North Korean soldiers into Russia to train for what is likely their direct involvement in the war in Ukraine, whether that be in the Kursk region or in occupied Ukraine itself. This is also at the same time that we're getting reports that now the American government backs up of the Russian government working with Chinese companies to start secretive drone programs to test drones in China, make those drones, ship them to Russia for them to be used against the Ukrainians, when the Chinese committed at the start of this war that they would be providing the Russians with no weapons. If we have these types of escalations happening and they're not responded to in some way, either through the implementation of some points of the peace plan or just a part of the peace plan, or new elements like reintroducing Ukrainian artillery, South Korean artillery shells into the war, you could end up doing the exact opposite of what the American government intends. The American government intends to get Ukraine in the best position while not escalating into a wider world war or some disastrous geopolitical crisis. What the Russians intend to do is to batter Ukraine just enough batter Ukraine enough to win, while not enough to drag in further allied involvement in the war, something that could actually cause them a loss or some disastrous consequence. Now, if they push for more North Korean involvement, so now that a second country is invading Ukraine, and that is not responded to in kind with something, for example, an approval of long-range strikes, tons and tons and tons of South Korean artillery shells, or the fulfill of parts of the victory plan, not only is there going to be questions on the ground in Ukraine if North Korea is a better ally to have than the United States, which is a wild thing to say out loud and could be questioned by elites in Washington, but is the vibe that I am getting from here on the ground. That's not the only problem you're going to have. The other problem you're going to have is that you're going to encourage the behavior. Because if you push and get no response, then all you're going to do is encourage them to push again. And they're going to keep pushing until they get a response, then abate, wait a little bit, and begin to push again. The goal here, if it is, as Biden claims, is for Ukraine to win while limiting escalatory potential, then there has to be some edging forward of the tools in Ukraine's tool belt. We cannot stay static, we cannot stay placated, or we cannot be satisfied with just Ukraine surviving or just losing a little bit of land because the Russians are moving forward. If the status quo is not working, then we have to change it and not just hope that it changes. So that means increased support. That means approvals of things like long-range strikes. And you don't need to agree with all of these things, but some of these things need to be on the table just so the Russians know that there could be consequences for these actions. And when these actions happen, there has to be some trigger pulled. Or you could end up bringing about the very thing that you feared the most, escalation, because they decided it's easier to push you than it is to back down. The situation right now is extremely tense. The frontline situation could certainly be better. And the main problems Ukraine has right now is manpower, which they've made some decisions to deal with that. There could be more made, but they made some decisions to deal with that, and supply. And the thing is, even if Ukraine deals with the first issue of manpower, those soldiers will just go to the front and die if we just give them bad equipment. If they're only operating BMP-1s and they're not operating more modern, better made, more protective equipment, then the manpower crisis is only going to get worse because all it takes is one bad bump on the front line and your BMP is exploded, because those things are combustion machines. So you need good gear for these men. Why mobilize, as has been requested by certain Western partners, the 18 to 25-year-old Ukrainians? Why mobilize this future of the country with a demographic decline when you need, why fight for a country if there's going to be no one to enjoy it? But why mobilize them if their lives are not going to be protected? If you want to deal with the manpower crisis, it's not just by acquiring more manpower, it's also by treating your manpower as valuable. And that's going to take good equipment, good gear to protect the soldier when they're on the front fighting in one of the most intensive wars on the planet. No, the most intensive war on the planet. And so while they could say it's a non-starter, some of this is necessary to stay in the fight. And so the question is the American government, during one of the most crucial parts of the war, when you're setting up any possible future negotiation, if it's coming in 2025, you're setting the tone, you're setting the base conversation for how that talk could go, or for where the future of the war goes, as the Russians are grinding down its offensive potential and trying to grab whatever resources they have to keep the pressure for as long as they can. At that moment, 2 to 3 years into the war, that's going to be when you pull out. It doesn't make any sense to me. It doesn't make any sense because I don't see how it's going to lead to a massive escalation to either increase the supply. And I also do not think that if you limit these long-range strikes by either saying that only strike facilities that are being used for the war or only strike facilities that are supporting the war effort in some way, that they're going to have nuclear escalatory potential. I don't see it. I could see the Russians huffing and puffing about it. I could see the Russians responding in other areas of the world by maybe trying to help the Houthis more. But I don't see the potential nuclear implications here, considering how the Russians have acted so far. And so the question has to be, at this point in the war, will the initiative be taken to get them the supply necessary? You can call it a non-starter, but it's a necessary not only for just winning the war, but holding the line that they have. Because the current supply and the current manpower is obviously not enough. The West needs to set more as reaction to North Korean soldiers. There just has to be some reaction. It cannot just be just murmurs and grumbles. It cannot be that. If North Korea is sending 12,000 troops and now Ukraine has to fight Russia, North Korea, like a ton of African mercenaries, Sri Lankan mercenaries, like at one point do we say, okay, if Russia's taking the cap off of all these things, there needs to be some counter leverage. Even if the West is looking at this completely cynically as we just want Ukraine to get a deal and get the war over with, to re-enter good trade, they have to be in a good negotiating position, or the Russians could just think they can just keep pressing the advantage so they can get literally everything they want. I can't come to any conclusion here where if this is true and where the situation stands as it is, the answer isn't doubling down on supporting Ukraine in the period before negotiations. Because if you want Ukraine to negotiate, they need to have leverage, and that leverage comes from military power. So even in the scenario where you want Ukraine to negotiate as soon as possible, they need the military force to be able to negotiate from a position of power. What do you think, Dylan? What is this? The intelligence community and Pentagon have recommended against changing U.S. policy to allow Ukraine to strike military targets deep inside Russia. Who is this? Senior White House correspondent, Fox News. The intelligence community and Pentagon have recommended against changing U.S. policy to allow Ukraine to strike military targets deep inside Russia with U.S.-made long-range missiles, citing greater cost than benefit. A U.S. official tells Fox the IC and DoD analysis shows a change in policy would not have a strategic impact or change the course of the war, in part because there are few targets outside of the ATACMS 300-kilometer range. By the way, can I just say, this thing they just say here, in August, the IC assessed that Russia had relocated more than 90% of the aircraft outside of ATACMS range. So it was a misconception that it would be a solution to glide bombs, etc. Can I just say, this is America's fault. That right there is 100% the fault of the Biden administration. Biden. When you think about who the fault that is, Biden. It's Biden's fault. If you wait and 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 you wait, and then the Russians, while you guys are debating in public whether you should allow these missiles, then move their aircraft back in preparation of that, and then you use your self-fulfilling prophecy of the public warnings you were basically giving the Russians, like, oh, well, now they're not even in. You brought this about. If you made this decision earlier, you could have had that impact. It could, and there's any million different moments that they could have picked up. It could have been the bombing of a children's hospital. That could have been the moment where they say, look, if Russia is going to continue to engage in such atrocities, we will continue to undermine such atrocities. There's a million different moments they could have picked up where it would have done more damage. Now, it will only take out 10%. It'll only take out some logistics. It'll only take out some ammo storage facilities. And it's not going to, in and of itself, change strategic overall impact. None of these on their own is going to change the overall strategic impact. It's about giving Ukraine as many tools in the tool belt as possible.
Take on the Twitch debacle by far.
Anyway, where were we? Yes. Misconception that would be. It's about building the Ukrainian tool belt so they have the most capacities available at any time so they can put pressure on the Russians from a billion different directions. That's the point. The recommendation is also due in part to limited short volumes. Ukraine doesn't have enough ATACMS, and DoD has advised the U.S. would not be able to further draw down from stocks without hurting U.S. military readiness. Here's another thing, and this might be the more controversial thing I say. A temporary reduction in American readiness for a war in Europe to fight the Russians in Europe, I think is more than perfectly fine. If the ATACMS are being used to hit Russian targets, and as long as we have enough ATACMS feasibly to deal with the other big American strategic
Burns
threat,
is an immoral,
we all know the
corrupt,
dragon in the room,
man.
then I don't see the problem. It's the same thing with like when I hear the Germans say we need these for our own army. It's like, okay, and what is the one other force that the Germans could conceivably see their army fighting? Or when the Poles say it, or with anybody, like, okay, what is the other army that the Poles? So Poland's at war. Who do you war game against? Are you wargaming against Austria? Or are you wargaming against Italy? How about Denmark? No. It seems to be every time the Russians. And so taking your resources and sending them to the fight where the Russians are fighting right now is detrimental to you preparing for the fight against the Russians in the future. I just, in most instances, I don't think the logic checks out. The official noted that Russia is a nuclear power capable of doing very bad things both to Ukraine and to the US, referencing warehouses being blown up and revelations made by a German spy chief last week that Russia was behind an attempted act of sabotage involving a parcel bomb placed on a plane this summer, which could have pushed Berlin and Moscow closer directly to war. Okay, wait. This is the thing that gets me. Moscow is making plots to blow up American military bases, blow up factories in Europe, doing fire bombings of buildings all across Europe, trying to bomb airplanes, and our reaction is, oh God, we better hold back on support to Ukraine. We don't want them doing those things that they're currently doing. We don't want them to bomb anything, as we see them planning to bomb things. We don't want them to do fire bombings, as we're seeing them doing fire bombings. We don't want them to place bombs on planes, as they're placing bombs on planes. Like, if the things are happening already, holding back on doing those things as a deterrent of stopping those things, it's like buying seal for a boat it's like trying to get stuff to plug a hole in a boat that's actively sinking. There's like 20 holes. It's done for, buddy. It doesn't make any sense to me. But I mean, maybe the argument is that they would ramp it up more if we approve long-range strikes. I could at least see that. Currently, the U.S. position is shared by Germany, which is not greenlit Taurus missiles, as well as the UK, which is not greenlit Storm Shadows. France, however, has authorized Scalps. Fox is told the Biden administration is considering more sanctions in response to North Korean troops coming to Russia. Well, I'm sure the North Koreans will run scared when they hear about the sanctions on their grain and on their cattle. I think, honestly, North Korea better prepare for Pyongyang to be sieged by these sanctions. Fox is told the Biden administration is considering more sanctions. The U.S. is currently in talks with allies and partners about the best court forward, the official said. If the Russians are leveraging another army to help invade Ukraine, you need a forceful response ready to be a counterbalance to those increased resources that the Russians are bearing down upon Ukraine. Just applying a few more sanctions here or having a diplomatic response here is the escalatory pathway. Just trying to jump off the escalation train when the Russians are full speed ahead, while you think could be the wise decision of you swerving out of the way, it means nothing if the Russians just take that as an indication to go full steam ahead. At least that's my perspective on it. But maybe I'm crazy. Maybe I'm a wackadoodle. Okay.